Planetary Health explores the human health impacts of global environmental change. It can focus on climate change, biodiversity loss, fishery collapses and land use changes like urbanization, the conversion of forest to fuel and firewood, or the conversion of rainforest to agricultural land, and many more. Planetary health scientists are interested in documenting and characterizing the relationship between these types of ecosystem transformations and human health outcomes, such as nutrition. The World Health Organization estimates that 1/4 of the entire burden of disease could be avoided through improved ecosystem management. This, to me, provides an enormous opportunity for us to correct many health ills through interventions directed at improved management of our natural systems. Forests and wildlife are important for a variety of reasons. They contain natural resource products that generate income and sustain local livelihoods. They are a source of ethnobotanical medicines that serve as a primary defense against disease for people who lack access to healthcare. And wild fruits, vegetables, meats, and freshwater fish can all be gathered that sustain the nutrition of countless people in the developing world. Sam Myers and Matt Smith of Harvard University modeled what would happen to the world food supply if insect pollinators were not facilitating agricultural productivity. This is not an unlikely future. Recently, researchers at Radboud University in the Netherlands and the Entomological Society Krefeld in Germany, using a 27-year longitudinal dataset, documented an alarming 75% decline in insect populations in German nature reserves. Assuming a complete loss of pollinators, approximately 71 million people in low-income countries could become newly deficient in vitamin A, and an additional 2.2 billion who are already consuming below the average requirement would have further declines in vitamin A supplies. A 100% decline in pollinator services could reduce global fruit, nuts, and seed supplies by nearly 1/4, and vegetables by 1/6. These startling dietary changes could increase global deaths yearly from non-communicable and malnutrition-related diseases by 1.42 million. This is an urgent call for improved management of pesticides and ecosystems to enable the thriving of insects, particularly animal pollinators. CIFOR, the Center for International Forestry Research, and colleagues like Terry Sunderland, Amy Ickowitz, Bronwyn Powell, Natalie Van Vliet, and Robert Nazi have done fascinating work investigating the role of forests in delivering these types of benefits to local food systems. In one of their papers from 2014, they found a statistically significant positive relationship between tree cover and dietary diversity. This is because fruit and vegetable consumption increases with tree cover until a peak of 45% tree cover. So, children in Africa who live in areas with more tree cover have more diverse and nutritious diets. Surprisingly, these researchers did not find a significant relationship between animal source food consumption and tree cover. This could be from a phenomenon coined by Kent Redford in 1992 called the empty forest. Redford describes a reality where forests can be healthy and intact, but many of the large animals are ecologically extinct from unsustainable hunting practices. Staggering trajectories and mass wildlife declines are happening across the globe. In a recent article, Hilary Young's group at UCSB found that the hunting of wildlife, mostly for food and medicinal products, is driving a global crisis in which 301 terrestrial mammal species are threatened with extinction. This map shows the species richness of wildlife species threatened by hunting. You can see threat hotspots in Southeast Asia, West Africa, and Madagascar. Yet, people are hunting these animals in many cases because they lack alternative foods and require adequate nutrition to sustain themselves and their families. The regions highlighted for hunting threats are the very same regions where food insecurity also peaks. Many of the interventions I'm most interested in focus on the delivery of affordable and accessible animal source foods to nutritionally vulnerable people in the developing world. Animal source foods are critical to micronutrient delivery, especially in the developing world, in areas where fortified and biofortified foods are absent, where vitamins and supplements are scarce, and infectious disease burdens make demand for micronutrients even higher. Animal source foods thus play a critical role in filling these gaps, particularly in the context of massive declines in wildlife. Throughout much of the developing world, and particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, many people rely on wildlife, often termed bushmeat, for food consumption. And today, the world is facing the 6th mass extinction event, with steep trajectories in wildlife declines, none perhaps as dire as the one in Madagascar, where lemurs are viewed as the most endangered taxa of animals on Earth. And yet, in northeastern Madagascar, a place where I have lived and worked for nearly 20 years, more than 90% of the Malagasy population rely on wildlife for food. From a nutritional perspective, more than 50% of the Malagasy population is stunted, and more than 40% of the population is anemic. And thus those two things come into conflict. In a place like Madagascar, wildlife is really important for human nutrition. In a longitudinal study, tracking pre-adolescent children over the course of a year, we found that there was a strong association between the consumption of wildlife and anemia. If wildlife became locally depleted and replaced with vegetarian products, which our data showed was highly likely due to the prohibitive financial costs of domesticated meats, then the incidence of anemia would increase by roughly 30% in the lowest income households. Make no mistake, I am not suggesting that we allow people to continue hunting to sustain themselves nutritionally. In almost all ecological systems, this would cause the decimation of wildlife populations and future nutritional insecurity. I am suggesting, however, that we understand this reliance on bushmeat to adequately position development and public health specialists to solve this arising conflict. After having done this type of research for more than a decade in Madagascar, I began seeing these types of headlines. The world is running out of fish faster than we thought. Death of coral reefs could devastate nations. Global warming could cause fishing to decline by millions of tons each year. I became more and more interested in understanding the extent to which the work I was doing in rural, remote rainforests of Madagascar was parallel to the crisis we were facing with global fisheries declines. We know that the global fisheries catch peaked in 1996 and has since been declining by 1 million metric tons per year. Through funding from the Wellcome Trust, Sam Myers and I put together a team to understand the interactions among climate change, marine fisheries, and human nutrition. Specifically, what we wanted to know was how declining fish catch would lead particular human populations toward alternative foods, and how these dietary changes would present specific nutritional vulnerabilities in different geographical and cultural contexts. Finally, we wanted to explore how aquaculture and fisheries management might be able to alleviate this tension between fishery declines and human food insecurity. First, let's focus on declining fish catch. Harnessing data from the Sea Around Us project, which is led by Daniel Pauly at the University of British Columbia, William Chung and Vicky Lamb were able to use estimates of fish catch data beginning in 1950 and produced annually up until the present to map changes in fish catch potential. These data were disaggregated by 4 fishing sectors: industrial, artisanal, subsistence, and recreational fish catch. This allowed our team to understand which fish would stay local for consumption and which fish would be exported into the market. What this data also allowed us to do was to observe the impacts of climate change on fish catch. Climate change will increase sea temperature and drive fish populations from the equator to the poles. It will also increase ocean acidification and reduce oxygenation of the sea, causing fish to be smaller in size and schools to have fewer fish. You can see the dark red area highlighting where fish catch is expected to decrease by 50% by 2050. As a public health specialist, I actually see a map highlighting where food insecurity and malnutrition will be the worst. So, with decreasing fish catch along the equator, what will people eat? My basic answer to this question is that if you stop eating fish, almost any other food you move into will be nutritionally inferior. Key nutrients, the rich long-chain fatty acids, vitamin B12, iron, zinc, and other minerals, are in very high concentrations in seafood. Losing these rich nutritional resources will have consequences. What types of nutritional consequences arise will depend on the dietary change experienced. We expect that there will be 3 typologies of countries affected by fish catch declines. There will be the wealthy, unaffected nations like the US, Japan, New Zealand, etc., where a local collapse in the fisheries will lead to slight price shifts or species shifts in the markets, but those who were eating fish before will continue to eat fish, and those who were not eating fish before will continue to not eat fish. Next, there will also be countries where undernutrition will increase. Places like Madagascar, Gabon, Suriname, and others. These are places where a local collapse of the fisheries will increase a reliance on tubers or staples or vegetarian foods, driving increases in micronutrient deficiencies. Finally, in countries like Indonesia, Brazil, Mexico, and islands of the South Pacific, a local collapse of the fisheries will accelerate the nutrition transition, where reductions in fisheries will cause a decline in traditional diets, accompanied by increases in Western diets, fast foods, processed foods, and a rise in metabolic disease. So where exactly do we anticipate there to be peaks in nutritional vulnerability from undernutrition? We overlaid these climate models of the impacts of sea temperature rise on fish catch and predicted the nutritional vulnerability of every coastal nation on Earth by looking at what they were currently consuming. This allowed us to predict the nutritional impacts of a decline in fish catch. Highlighted are the countries that have the highest seafood dependency and are at a threshold for nutritional deficiencies with their current diet. You can see that Southeast Asia and West and Central Africa appear to be the most vulnerable to undernutrition. So how do we fix this? Aquaculture will help, but will not fix it alone. Aquaculture production outpaced wild fish catch production a few years ago. However, aquaculture is not currently oriented to support the nutrition of vulnerable populations in the developing world. In looking at the 40 most nutritionally vulnerable nations on Earth, with respect to seafood, we notice 3 different typologies of countries. First, in the dark red, we have countries that produce little to no aquaculture. These countries won't benefit nutritionally from aquaculture because they are not producing it, and the market will not deliver it to them. Secondly, in yellow, we have countries that are producing a lot of aquaculture, but it's export-oriented. It would rely on the economic benefits to trickle down and benefit local people who are nutritionally vulnerable, which is very unlikely to happen. And finally, we have the countries in green, who are large aquaculture producers, who are retaining aquaculture in domestic products. The problem here is that very often the fish are still not going to nutritionally vulnerable people, often landing in megacities or with wealthier households. Aquaculture will not deliver nutritional benefits unless it is designed that way from the outset. This is the case in Cambodia and Bangladesh, where they've seen major successes in mixed rice fish farming that can deliver nutritional benefits. Finally, we also need to consider improvements in fisheries management. Currently, 60% of fisheries are either overexploited or fully collapsed. An additional 35% are fully exploited. We need to reframe fisheries management toward new goals, providing nutritional benefits, allowing fisheries to recover, and delivering seafood to local populations. This then targets environmental conservation as a key strategy in nutritional interventions. This is a positive outcome, where a healthy marine ecosystem causes an increase in fishery productivity and sustainably stabilizes human food security.